This conference will now be recorded.
Well, welcome everybody to today's PPI BCD member webinar called Life Cycle Assessment and Environmental Product Declarations. This is a really interesting topic that a lot of people have asked for information on over the last year or more. And we're fortunate at PPI that we've come across people with great expertise in this topic that have agreed to provide this member webinar to us today. We have Nicole Meyer and Wendy Hennessy, both of Sustainable Solutions Corporation. I first bumped into Nicole at the ASTM Sustainability Conference back on April 8th over the coffee pot, literally, and we got to talk just for a few minutes. But I heard how great her presentation was, and then a few weeks later, Wendy Hennessy reached out to us at PPI to see if she could help offer information on this topic, and we said, hey, let's start with a member webinar. This would be a great way of teaching a lot of us things that we don't know about EPDs and LCAs. The rules, the regulations, what does the terminology mean? There's a really good presentation outline in the invitation that was sent out for this. And short bios of both of today's presenters are also in the email invitation that you received. So Nicole is a Senior Account Manager at Sustainable Solutions Corp. and a Life Cycle Assessment Certified Professional with experience in international standards for LCA, EPDs, and product stewardship. Wendy is a Senior Account Manager at Sustainable Solutions Corporation, and she's been in the sustainability space for over 10 years and has experience in LCAs, EPDs, green marketing, and scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which I have questions about in terms of understanding all of these things. But I think today's presentation is going to take away a lot of the mystery on these topics. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy and Nicole and ask them to educate us today. So thank you both for joining us.
Great, Nicole, you go to Nicole, you have control of the slides?
Yeah, Wendy, was there anything else you wanted to add just as far as intros go?
Well, just that I just joined SSC in June. It sounds like a very short tenure so far, but I'm very familiar with SSC. I was with UL Environment for 15 years, and we consistently used SSC as a consultant when we could not fulfill our clients' needs for life cycle assessments and environmental product declarations. And that's a short intro of who I am, so thank you for having me.
Great, and yes, thank you, Lance, for that introduction. And for those of you who may have attended the ASTM webinar, some of the slides might seem familiar, but I think repetition is the key when it comes to this space. The more you're exposed to it, the more you feel comfortable with some of these concepts. I am an LCA certified professional, so that's just meaning getting into the nitty-gritty of all of the understandings of the different international standards, the nuances that can come between different EPD development, the product category rules. So if I go a little too fast, or if you have any questions, please let me know. I don't know if there's a chat feature for this go-to, Lance, but if anyone wants to start aggregating any questions, we can make sure we can get to those at the end if we have time as well.
Yes, there actually is a chat button, so people can submit questions via chat. I will monitor that through the presentation. We can look at them after the chat, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So at the end, as long as we have time, people can just unmute themselves and ask questions if they'd like to at the end as well. We're going to record for the first, let's say the main part of the presentation. Then once we get into Q&A, we'll stop the recording function and just have a conversation if that's what people would like to do.
Perfect. Yes, we got a lot of content to go through, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. All right, great. So very briefly, for those who might not know who Sustainable Solutions is, we are a woman-owned corporate sustainability consulting firm. So we've been around since 2001. As you can imagine, sustainability wasn't as hot of a topic back then, but we mainly got our start in LEED. So that's one of the first acronyms you're going to see is Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's a green building standard. So we do have a full team that just works in LEED certification for cities and communities, existing buildings. And there's also other designations like building and construction or operations and maintenance, core and shell. So we do a lot of actual building work, on-site energy audits, water audits, things like that. Our corporate sustainability pillar is really my niche, where we do a lot of life cycle assessment, environmental product declarations. product stewardship, product innovation tools. We even develop generators. So we have EPD or life cycle assessment generators that we can do to really kind of streamline the development of EPDs, especially for some of our clients that have thousands of SKUs that they're working for, and they have to develop EPDs more on demand for specific projects. And then lastly, as you can see, we do a lot of training and education in this space. I am a self-proclaimed LCA nerd, so if you have any questions again, or if I say any acronyms you don't understand, please pop them in the chat, and I'm more than happy to get those answered for you. Great, and yeah, so thank you, Wendy. Yeah, we do get referred by a lot of different program operators, and we get referrals to develop LCAs just based on our quality of work. So we've been doing life cycle assessment and EPD work since 2007 across many industry sectors, but really focusing in on building and construction, and especially how those EPDs can be used in the building and construction space or for infrastructure, and really understanding that demand and how the EPDs can satisfy those demands as well for different industry sectors. Great. So normally when I do like live sessions, I'll usually ask the audience to raise their hands if they have a good understanding of the different Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. For this, I'll just pretend I see some hand raising. Typically, it's not too many that have a good understanding of all three emission types. But Scope 1 emissions are the emissions that are generated on site. So think of your plant, if you have a manufacturing plant, a fabrication plant, whatever you're doing, the operations at your site. Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions that are being generated from your site. So if you have any propane tanks, you have natural gas ovens, if you have on-site landfills or wastewater treatment, those are all Scope 1 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 2 emissions, those are more indirect. So that's really coming from your electricity grid. So think of where your plants are located. Based on the region of where your plant is located, your Scope 2 emissions will be highly impacted by that grid mix. So Scope 2 is typically seen as more indirect, where Scope 1 is more direct. And you might be asking, why the heck am I talking about greenhouse gas emissions when we're talking about life cycle assessment? The reason is because there is crossover between that data collection effort. So if your company or as a corporate goal, you're already tracking your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, chances are you do have a good amount of the data that you would need to develop a life cycle assessment study. So you would need to understand all of the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions that are going on at your plant in order to then allocate those impacts at the product level for a life cycle assessment study. So Scope 1, Scope 2, think corporate-wide, think site-wide, where life cycle assessment then takes that data and allocates it down to a product. So Scope 1, Scope 2, mainly the easier, quote, easier emissions to really get a handle on, whereas Scope 3 emissions are really everything else. So you do have less control over your Scope 3 emissions, and it's everything that is pretty much upstream or downstream of what's going on within your areas of control. So when we're saying Scope 3 emissions, there are 15 categories to Scope 3 emissions. And I have listed them here, but if anyone wants a read, you can look over the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. There's technical guidance for calculating Scope 3 emissions. There's also different resources available to see which of these emissions might be most material to your industry or to your specific operation. So if anyone's interested in any of those resources, please let me know. I'm happy to send them out. Well, typically, for a company's Scope 3 emissions, the biggest drivers will typically come from purchased goods and services. Again, this can depend on where your industry is, but a lot of the times your Scope 3 emissions are going to be impacted by the goods that you are purchasing from your suppliers. So a lot of that upstream impact of thinking of all the materials you have to buy, all the support materials, everything that you need for your plant to operate, all of those purchased goods and services count as a Scope 3 category. And in some cases, your Scope 3 emissions can count up to 90% or more of your corporate emissions. So they are very large. They are very difficult to get a handle on. What's nice, LCA does have some tie over with Scope 3 reporting, but it's, again, more at the product level versus corporate level. So for a life cycle assessment, though, we would be collecting data on your materials that you're sourcing to manufacture your end product, understanding the transportation of those materials to your site. So you are getting an understanding of some of these categories. Waste generated in operations, we'll be collecting some of that data as well. But again, just prefacing it is more product level when we're doing life cycle assessment versus Scope 3 at a corporate level, which is very large. It's a big undertaking.
Nicole, if you could go back one slide.
This way?
Yep, just really quick, something that I learned that makes this a little bit easier when thinking about scope 1, 2, and 3 is think about scope 1 as anything that you burn. Scope 2 is anything that you buy, and scope 3 is everything beyond. So I always like to keep in mind that burn, buy, beyond, kind of keep it straight in my head. Just a little trick there. Go ahead.
Great, thank you.
And if I could ask you a question, this is Lance. Within our industry, as I'm sure you're aware, we deal with lots of different standards from organizations and CSA and American Waterworks Association, standards development groups that write lots of rules and regulations and code bodies. Who writes these rules about scope 1, 2, and 3? Where does this come from?
Of course, great question, Lance. And it is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. That is the operating authority really right now behind scope 1 and scope 2, scope 3 reporting. I am seeing some industry specific guidance. I know, for example, like the steel industry, they have the Global Steel Climate Council guidance that just got released in July that has recommendations for like the operational boundaries when you're reporting scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. But you will see that those standards will always defer back to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So that's really the main what you're going to be following. And then there might be some sector specific guidance, but they're always in alignment with this Greenhouse Gas Protocol.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Perfect. So this is your scope 3 category thinking of you as an organization and your upstream and your downstream. But if you flip that, think of it as all of your end customers. Think of who you're selling to. They also have scope 3 emissions and you are their scope 3 emissions. So anyone that is purchasing from you, you represent a scope 3 emission to them. So think of any of your end customers that have set these net zero goals. They're very ambitious. They want to get to net zero by 2030, 2050. Part of net zero is scope 3 emissions reporting and accounting. So that's why you might see an influx of more of your end customers sending out maybe EcoVadis forms or supplier surveys trying to better understand what are the life cycle impacts of your products because that rolls into their own scope 3 reporting. And I included, these are just 3 examples. There are hundreds more examples of different companies setting scope 3 goals. But it might be a good effort and a good practice to look at some of those customers that you have and see if they have set any net zero goals and then think how you can then help them with your own LCA, your own data to help bolster up their own reporting for their scope 3 emissions. So just examples like Lowe's committed to a 25% reduction, P&G by 2040, they're looking for 40% in supply chain emissions, you know, a lot of retailers. You're seeing this across a lot of different end sectors, especially now in the tech space. A lot of corporate goals are being set for net zero. One way you can see who set goal is going by the Science Based Target Initiative or SBTI. Again, happy to send over that link too. You can see who set what goals and what targets that they've set in alignment with the Science Based Target Initiative. Perfect, Wendy.
So now we're going to go through the life cycle assessment and what a life cycle assessment is. These are some of the key terms and acronyms. As you know, the industries that we're dealing in, there's a lot of acronyms and terms, so we've put together a glossary here for you. EPD, obviously, for Environmental Product Declaration. GWP, think of global warming potential. ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, a lot of the ISO standards are used when creating EPDs and LCAs. We don't want to get too into the weeds, though. Of course, LCA life cycle assessment, exactly what we're talking about. Product category rule, PCR, and sometimes known as APSR, which is a product-specific rule. And then TRACY is used by the EPA, and it's a tool for reduction and assessments of chemicals and other environmental impacts. So your LCA will be reporting out in the TRACY format.
And we'll get into more information on TRACY, but that's typically used more in North America as well as the method to get your impacts.
Correct. Thank you. So a life cycle assessment, it's basically, if I were to put it into a nutshell, a life cycle assessment is when you look at the production of your product and you look at all the inputs from raw material gathering to the end of life. So if you were to think of all the processes that your product goes through during a life cycle assessment, we gather the raw materials. We obviously transport those raw materials to the manufacturing facility. Then at the manufacturing facility, the manufacturing obviously takes place. Then it leaves your factory, goes into distribution, and then installation and use and maintenance is the next cycle, and of course, end of life. And what the life cycle assessment does is it measures all the environmental impacts throughout this entire life cycle. Nicole is going to go into the different types of life cycle assessments because not all life cycle assessments are cradle to gate. Some will cut off here at the manufacturing, which is what we call cradle to gate. So I'll let Nicole go into that.
Great, yeah. And again, you're lucky you're virtual because normally I'd have people in person to guess what these type of life cycle stages are. But as Wendy was alluding to, if we are just looking at raw material extraction to your manufacturing gate, this is a type of boundary. So just understanding when you are conducting a life cycle assessment, there will be guidance on what you should include within that study based on your industry, based on the product that you're looking at. So if you are limiting the study from just raw material extraction to manufacturing, that's called a cradle to gate study. So you will see this publicly disclosed on any environmental product declarations. It will tell you what the system boundary of that study was. So if you see cradle to gate, just know that that study was cut off at the manufacturing gate. So you're not seeing any of the impacts downstream of once that product leaves the manufacturing gate. Conversely, though, if you are including the entire life cycle of the product, that's going to be called a cradle to grave assessment. So as the name's alluding to, cradle meaning raw material extraction and processing through end of life. So this is being able to understand what is happening to your product distribution pathways, how is my product being used, what is the reference service life, what are the installation requirements, and then ultimately what's happening at end of life. Can my product be reused? Can it be repurposed? Does it go to landfill? Does it go to waste to energy? What happens at end of life? And this is where a lot of the times product manufacturers will lean on the product category rule that was developed for that industry, because typically what will happen in the product category rule development is that great minds will come together and determine what is actually happening to their products at end of life. And that provides the guidance then for every other practitioner or manufacturing developing an LCA to that PCR. There's also this one that's kind of in between. It's called cradle to gate with options. And this can show up sometimes if there's a life cycle stage that might not be material or important in a full cradle to grave, maybe like the use or the distribution. And you can pick and choose which life cycle you did want to include in. A lot of the times you would see cradle to gate plus end of life when someone's choosing a cradle to gate with options. But you don't see this too much, but just wanted to note it in case you do see it on any environmental product declarations that you look at. Now, embodied carbon, this is another term. I like to bring this up because a lot of people might not realize embodied carbon is really trying to say the same thing as global warming potential. It's looking at the locked in emissions of a building, I guess you could say, of like all the emissions that have been released of those materials, of those products that are used to construct a building, construct a site, and infrastructure. That's what embodied carbon is meaning. Versus, years prior to this, it was a big focus on operational carbon, of shutting off your lights, of how can you be as efficient as you can while the building's in use. But now there's been a great emphasis on the actual embodied carbon of a building, of a project. What are those emissions looking like? And embodied carbon is what you will see written into legislature. So if you want to look up any legislation, type in embodied carbon legislation, Colorado, California, New York. That's how you will be able to better understand what exists. They're using that terminology as embodied carbon. And there is a hot link here to the Carbon Leadership Forum. They're a super great resource. I definitely recommend looking at them And I'll show you later on, they have a whole map of all the different state legislation, federal legislation that's happening surrounding embodied carbon too. I don't want to go too much into the weeds in this, but just understanding that life cycle assessment is developed to international standards. So there are standards we have to adhere to as practitioners when we're developing the study. So anyone developing a life cycle assessment has to adhere to a minimum of the ISO 1440 and 1444 requirements. These are not certifications that you need to your site. That's not something that you need to pursue. It's more so that the practitioner of the study has to make sure they're developing the LCA in accordance with these standards. They're very much just transparency. They want to know a lot about how you did your study, why you did it, why you did this allocation method. It's all about transparency. Then when you're developing an EPD, there are additional standards that you have to be mindful of. And this includes the ISO series. Again, I don't want to go too much into the details, but for EPDs, you will need a product category rule. So you will develop your EPD to that product category rule that is providing sector-specific guidance. And we do have a slide on that, so I can show more information there too. There are different types of life cycle assessment based on the goal. So what are you trying to get out of your study? If you just want to do an EPD, what that is, it's a snapshot of your current performance. So we're going to be collecting data. It's 2024 now. Say we'll collect data from the 2023 calendar year. That EPD is going to be a snapshot of your environmental impacts for that 2023 calendar year. So it's just like a baseline, an understanding of what are my environmental impacts looking at this snapshot in time. You could also do what's called an LCA optimized or LCA optimization. This is when you've already established your baseline and then you have a new product. Say you think it's more innovative, it has recycled content, it has, I don't know, circularity principles, it had more sustainable manufacturing that happened during that year. So you want to be able to show that optimization. So that's basically doing a baseline product that you have, you made an improvement, and then you're able to show the reductions as well. So that's what's called an optimization. You do get additional credits in LEED if you do show optimization. So just keeping that in mind, you can get additional points in some of those green building standards. There's also the comparative LCA. This is definitely the most complex, the most difficult. I'll be very transparent with that. And this is when you want to compare to a competing product or competing industry. But in order to do this, you need to make sure you're having an apples to apples comparison and that you are collecting primary data from both systems so that it can pass muster when it comes to critical review. And it does have a 3-person panel. So these first 2 options are a 1-person review, whereas this comparative, you do need to get it passed by a 3-person panel of industry experts and someone who's an expert of both of those comparative systems as well. Perfect. And then for those in building and construction, what the output of your life cycle assessment, that will typically come in the form of an environmental product declaration. Whereas if maybe there are some suppliers on this call, if there is, you don't make an end product, right? So there might not be a product category rule for you, but you're still getting asked to provide this life cycle assessment data. What you could do is develop it in accordance with those core standards that I mentioned before, those ISO 1440, 1444, get that LCA critically reviewed, and then have a fact sheet. So that's another option. If there is no product category rule, if an EPD just doesn't make sense because you're an upstream supplier, you don't make an end product, you can always do a fact sheet and use that to give to your customers. And then they can use that data in their own EPD. So life cycle assessment really focuses on environmental impacts. I just want to make that clear. There are other documents and certifications that would focus on like human health impacts, or there's single criterion like recycled content that you could get as well. LCA is definitely holistic. You are looking at environmental impacts. I know we focus on carbon, which is this global warming potential. There are other indicators though. So just keep that in mind. It's not just a single criterion of carbon. That would be your product carbon footprint. But life cycle assessment does provide other impact assessment categories as well. Again, mainly environmental, because there is greater uncertainty in the human health impacts. And I can show you, but those would normally be omitted from an EPD. Your life cycle assessment, as I mentioned, it's a snapshot. It's meant to show you what are the hot spots in my product's life cycle, identify opportunities for improvement, and then it can also be used to satisfy customer requests, green building standard requirements. So it's a tool used for communication out that you've shown that you can understand what are the environmental impacts of your product. More importantly, maybe, is what it does not provide. It does not provide, as I mentioned, the human health impacts of your product. For that, you could use something like a health product declaration or a declare label. When you are making comparisons, like even internally for optimization, just understand that LCA will not disclose like structural integrity or performance attributes. So if you're looking to substitute maybe one material for another, just understand you might need more of that material versus the baseline. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one when you're looking at substitutions from an LCA perspective. And it is not intended as a sole basis for marketing claims. So what I mean is that if you have an EPD, your competitor has an EPD, you'll get into a little bit of hot water if you say, look, we're so much better than our competitor. They are trying to get there. I know the EPA just released its new criteria about their labeling program. They are trying to get to a point where there can be more comparability because they're really tightening up how the product category rules are being developed. But as it stands right now, comparing EPDs, just don't use that as your sole basis for marketing content. Do not compare EPDs. It says in your EPD they're not meant for comparison. So it says it right in the document itself. And that's because there can be variation that occurs from one study to the next. Even if Wendy and I did the same LCA study, there might be different data sets that were used. Maybe she chooses a different LCA software. The functional unit, declared unit should be consistent if there's a product category rule. If there's not, though, then there can be variability. So a lot of this would be determined by a product category rule, but not things like the actual data sets or the database that you're using or the software. That's where really variation can occur. Even allocation methods, some might use a mass allocation, some might use economic. So again, both can be correct, you just have to justify it, right? But they can lead to differences in your life cycle assessment study. And this is just one example I like to use as far as like data, just using a different data set alone. So one is an example from one software and the other is an example from another software. So you'll see that one is just looking at US, one is looking at rest of world, but even just that decision of one data set can kind of change the output of your results. So just keeping that in mind, that's why there can be variability from one LCA to the next, and why this new criteria guidance is really trying to make a stricter list, I guess you could say, of the data sets to use when you are developing an LCA or an EPD. Now, there are 4 phases of a life cycle assessment. This is by ISO. The first step is really defining your goal and scope. So say you're coming to me, you're coming to another practitioner, you're saying, look, I need to develop an LCA. I don't know where to start, right? So we're defining the goal, the scope of the project. Then we're doing the data collection portion, which is called the life cycle inventory. We're taking that data and providing you with your actual impact results, which is the life cycle impact assessment, and then the final interpretation of those results. So when we're doing the first phase, the goal and scope, why are you doing this study? Do you need an EPD? Are you trying to make comparisons? Or is it for internal? Is it external? What is the goal of the study? That will determine your scope. So the scope will be, okay, what are the products that you want to include? Do you make many products at one site? Do you want to include all of those products? Do you want to just look at one specific SKU? We'll want to know the function unit. Is there a product category rule that we can use to develop the EPD for? Assumptions, limitations, all of that will get captured. And then when you're looking at how to actually scope your project, again, talk with your sales and marketing team. I've had so many times where different team members might come to me and they're like, oh, we need an EPD. They're talking with another project team. No, we need an EPD for this SKU because we got this project request. So talk with each other. See if you have any requests that have already come in for an EPD. You might have, quote, more sustainable products that you want to market and get out there and use the EPD for that purpose. Any lead projects? Lead V5 is coming around the corner. Do you have any EPDs to meet lead specifications, highest ranking or highest volume products? Those, kind of keep that thinking in mind. Geographic boundary, again, where are your sites located? Do you own your sites or are they contract manufactured? Because I can say from experience, it can be a little more difficult getting data from contract manufacturers than it might be from your own operations. Thinking of transportation, thinking of all the different sites involved in that process. And then actual data collection, can you collect data for at least 12 months? That's the best practice, is 12 months of data continuously. If you've had any shutdowns, if you've had any things like that that might interrupt that data collection period, you should think that as well when you're thinking of scoping your project. Great, Wendy?
Yeah, So product category rules, we keep mentioning product category rules, PCRs. I like to really simplify this by saying a product category rule is basically the rules on how you perform the life cycle assessment. So any LCA practitioner that is doing a life cycle assessment must follow the product category rules. That means they're using the same declared units, that they're using the same measurements, the same boundaries, the same scope. So I like to make it really simple and just say it's the rules on how the life cycle assessment is done. Because if we all used a different rule book, we would all be all over the map. And of course, the word product denotes the fact that the product category rule is specific to that product. So you have to be very careful when you choose your product category rule, and the PCR will spell out exactly what the product category encompasses. They're developed by program operators such as UL Environment, NSF, ASTM, International EPD, but LCA practitioner firms like SSC, we do not create the product category rules. We can sit on committees that create these rules, but it's the program operators that create the PCRs, and we are not a program operator. We do the life cycle assessment. They're typically valid for 5 years in North America. So I believe as of today, what we have pictured here is the product category rule that exists for rigid and flexible building piping systems in North America. The drawback is that if you look at the bottom in the fine print, this product category rule has expired. So in order to reactivate this product category rule, the association or whoever would need to reach out to a program operator and create or update this product category rule. It's specifically, this product category rule was done by ICCES. You can see in the link there. So the first step would be to get an update on this product category rule so your association and its members can begin the life cycle assessment, because to do an EPD, you have to have the product category rule.
And Wendy, when people are working on these product category rules, whether it's to develop in the first place or to revise them, do they reach out to industry? Like in our case, would they reach out to piping manufacturers or
Yes.
an organization like PPI to try to gather data to?
Absolutely. So it's usually it's a public call. Usually you'll see it on LinkedIn or maybe email you specifically, but they'll reach out to institutions, associations, manufacturers, NGOs. What am I missing, Nicole?
Academia. Yeah, it's a big.
Academia, that was it. And usually the calls last for 30 to 60 days. So they'll open up that committee so everybody gets to weigh in and give their commentary on how the product category rules should be put together.
And if you saw in the EPA's recent funding list, if you don't have that list, I'm happy to send it over. A lot of the funding did go to like association levels and for PCR development. So they are really actively trying to get these PCRs better refined, and that's why they also released that EPA criteria for developing product category rules. And if you wanted to engage in this process, I think you guys work with NSF a lot for your testing and things like that already. So you might feel more comfortable moving forward with them, but you could go to other program operators as well to help facilitate the PCR development. And I think there was a question that came in or a hand raise.
Actually, there's 2 questions from David Fink. The first one was, and this was a few minutes ago, can you comment on if you are seeing material EPDs being used in purchasing processes and material selections by end users?
Yeah, so I am seeing that already as criteria. I'm trying to think of the publicly available. I can send over some publicly available examples of that happening right now. of actual end product manufacturers requiring this when they are sourcing or integrating it into their procurement policies.
Okay, thank you. And then the second question was, is funding required to get a PCR reactivated? Because the example you just gave with the piping PCR already being expired, do people need funding to spend the time to get them reactivated, or is this a simple ballot just to reapprove it as is, or
It
how
is
does
a
that work?
cost. Yeah, so there definitely is a cost associated with it to develop PCRs. Depending on who you go with, that cost can range. I believe I've seen, again, we don't do PCR development, but I believe a safe range might be like in the 25,000 to 50,000 range of developing a PCR for an industry. So you might even have different competitors within the industry coming together to fund that cost. And it does take time as well. So sometimes even for an update, if you need to make sure you're getting, for example, this latest EPA criteria in there or guidance from the ACLCA in there, it can typically take months to years in some cases that I've seen to develop PCRs.
Okay, good, thank you.
Of
And then we have
course.
a new question on this topic from Everin. Everin's question is, are PCRs standardized, or will each manufacturer have to develop their own PCR with one of the mentioned program operators? And part two, if there is already a developed PCR, like the example you showed, can they be used by others?
So yes, they are meant for standardization across. It's not manufacturer specific. That would be, oh, that would be such a headache. That would be so much work. No, so they are definitely, they're product specific. So looking at these examples, for example, anyone that makes a cladding product would fall underneath that PCR. So it's definitely not manufacturer specific. So absolutely that exists. And for the PCR, it just needs to be valid. So unfortunately, if that PCR is expired, you cannot use an expired PCR. You do need an existing PCR to develop an EPD.
All right, great, thank you. I think that's
Sure.
up to date in the questions so far.
Awesome. In the interest of time, I might go a little bit quickly because I do have a lot of slides to get through. But again, please keep putting your questions in the chat and we can make sure we get those answered either at the end or as a follow-up too. But yeah, so if a PCR, how to know if one exists, there are a lot of different databases you can leverage to see if one exists. These are European as well. So in the instances where we were not able to find one in North America, we were able to use a European PCR, or you could even develop it to like a core standard. We've done that as well, where you're using like ISO 21930 as your core PCR. So there are some workarounds if a PCR doesn't exist and you really do need to develop an EPD. So there are some workarounds there. Perfect. So after we develop the whole goal and scope, it really then becomes on to the manufacturer or the person developing the LCA to get all that data, right? So we need to get all the product level data, manufacturing data, and all of this information is going to be allocated to that functional unit. So if you're looking at, a meter of pipe, or you're looking at a kilogram of product, whatever that functional unit is of the study, all that data is going to get allocated to that functional unit. Data collection is no joke. I like to be very upfront and honest. It takes a lot of time. It takes resources. It definitely will take a dedicated member of your team. I many often it's kind of something that gets added to someone's workload already. Just understand it does take a lot of work to get this data. So a lot of different departments will be contributing to this as well, where we need to get bills of materials, the entire product recipe for the product, all of that production data. So just think a year's worth of production data. Think yourselves right now, do you have that data available? Do you know who you go to get that information? So electricity, energy, fuels, packaging, do you have that data readily available for last year? Any of the use phase data, like the maintenance of the actual use, the reference service life of your product, distribution, and then end of life. And as I mentioned, there can be a lot of different team members involved. So it might not just be a one-person effort. If you're a very, very small company, then maybe. But if you have a larger operation, typically different team members will be involved, whether it's EHS, the product managers, procurement. So they might have their own piece of the pie to get to that full data collection, that full data set. There are best practices though. So really identifying what team members are responsible, have deadlines. And I know one of the questions was, what are the hurdles with LCA? And data collection is one of them. I can point that out. Every project that we do, no matter how enthusiastic people may come into it, there is always a piece of information that they might not have realized they don't really have the best clarity on. So just understanding that data collection can be a hurdle, give your teams grace, but also understanding what are actual deadlines, what is realistic, who can provide that data, and in what timeline, because it is a very data intensive process to develop a life cycle assessment. But then after all that data is collected, you can take a breath, and then it really comes on us, the practitioner, to develop the model. So we'll take all that data. We do process flow review meetings, though. We also have done on-site assessments just to make sure everything's accurate with what was provided. So we do gut checks, we do quality checks. Then we develop the lifecycle assessment model using all that data. And there are different softwares you could use. The two main ones I would say are CIMAPRO and Sphera, now called LCA for Experts. Those are the two really big software programs that you can use. There are other free ones as well, just in case internally you want to, play around, see different models there. But we do, CIMAPRO or Sphera. We're agnostic when it comes to software, so whichever our client would want to choose, that's what we can go with. And from that software, there'll be this what's called lifecycle impact assessment methods. Both Sphera and CIMAPRO have the same impact assessment methods, so there's no variation there. But Tracy, the one that Wendy was mentioning before, this is developed by the EPA. So essentially, this is the EPA's way of saying, all right, you're using 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. That translates into this much carbon, global warming potential. So that's, kilogram CO2 equivalencies, carbon dioxide equivalencies. It's all of those greenhouse gases, not just carbon. And it's giving you your environmental impacts. Again, GWP is what most people look at. Most people are focusing in on that, but there are other indicators. So there's ozone layer depletion, acidification. How does your product affect acid rain? Or, you look at the coral reefs, acidification like that. Eutrophication potential, that's if you're using a lot of bio-based materials, you might actually see a spike in that impact category. So there can be trade-offs. If you're thinking new product development, there might be a trade-off between carbon and eutrophication. So just understanding what's material, what's important to you, what's important to your customers. And this lovely graph is showing just an example of some of your outputs. At first, it can be a little overwhelming. But what this is showing, so all those life cycle stages I mentioned before. So from raw materials, the transport of those materials, your manufacturing, how are you packaging them, distribution, use, end of life. What this graph is showing you, it's representing the hot spots of all of those life cycle stages across each impact category. So using global warming as your example, if you are fully focused on global warming, what's driving my carbon impact? You're going to see that it's actually packaging and your raw materials that are driving the impact for your global warming. So thinking, new product development, how can we reduce impacts from our packaging? Can we lightweight it? Can we integrate recycled content? Raw materials, can we substitute any of our raw materials? We know that that's driving our impact. Which of our materials is driving it, and how can we work with our suppliers to maybe reduce that impact? Say you don't care about global warming, you care about water depletion, then you'll see that your manufacturing and your raw materials are driving that impact. So from a manufacturing and operational stance, can you do anything like closed loop systems? Is there any way you can operate more efficiently, reduce your water consumption? So this is what this graph is meant to show you, is just your relevant hotspots. LCA will go into even deeper dives as well, of showing, okay, what material is driving the impact? What in my manufacturing is driving my impact? Is it my electricity? Is it my fuels? So it really does provide a lot of great data just for an overall, environmental stewardship program. And you'll see that these human health impacts are typically omitted from an EPD because they have less certainty in those results. And then the last phase is, okay, we have our results, that's great, now what? What do we do? So it's interpreting the results, finding opportunities for improvement, or you could use those results for an environmental product declaration. So you'll notice the EPD does not come until the very end of a project. This is basically your final certification to show, hey, we've done our life cycle assessment, these are the results, and here's how we're presenting those results in alignment with that product category rule. So EPDs are good for 5 years, so that's a benefit. Yes, they do have an upfront cost, but what's nice is that they are valid for 5 years. It's not an annual renewal. I am seeing, though, just some standards, some requirements coming from the EU. They are looking at more annual updates. I haven't seen that here yet, so just want to keep that on the horizon. As of now, EPDs are good for 5 years. And then how to read an EPD. So what is the actual information that's located on your EPD? This, it's usually the second page of an EPD will have all that goal and scope information that I mentioned before. So if you're trying to find out, you're looking at an EPD of another company, or if you're just, looking at what is the coverage of that EPD, that'll be located on the second page. So it'll tell you this EPD was developed for this product. It covers this time period. It was developed to this product category rule. So it has all that goal and scope information on that second page. Towards the end of your EPD, that's where you'll actually see your environmental impact results. So as I showed on that graph, it'll show you what are those impacts for each of those life cycle stages. Now it's a little small, but if you can see A1 through A3, that is your cradle to gate impacts. So it will group them together. So cradle to gate, and then it'll go into transportation, it'll go into distribution, it'll go into end of life. So then there are other modules there as well, because this is a full cradle to grave study that's used as an example. Now, say a customer needs to know your total carbon number, like what is this for our project? We need to know what the value is. What you would do is take that global warming potential row. So as I've highlighted here, you would add up all of those values to get to your total kilogram CO2 equivalency number. Now, again, remembering this has all been allocated to the functional unit. So this would be to a meter or to a kilogram. So when you need it for the entire product, you have to take this number and multiply it. If it's a 10 meter long, tube that you're using, times it by 10, and then that's what you can give to your customer. Because all of these impacts are allocated to that functional unit or declared unit in that EPD. There are other ways to make this mean something. I know this is scientific notation. You can translate that into something a little bit more understandable, like 385 kilogram CO2 equivalencies. And then you can also use the EPA's greenhouse gas equivalencies calculator. This takes this number and makes it more meaningful. So what the heck does 385 kilogram CO2 equivalencies mean to me? That's also equivalent to 987 miles driven by a gasoline powered vehicle. They have a lot of other things you could choose to make it, a little bit more understanding of what does this value actually mean. Where can you find your EPDs? So your EPDs will be uploaded by the program operator you chose. So whether that's, NSF or ASTM or UL, whoever you choose, they have their own databases of EPDs. And you can also upload them to third-party databases as well. So this is what architects and designers may use when they're specifying materials or products for a specific project, like Ecomedes or Mindful Materials, Sustainable Minds. These are all databases where you can upload all of your certifications. So your EPDs, your HPDs, your cycle content, everything can get uploaded to these databases. I definitely recommend taking a peek if you're not familiar with these, because I know they are getting leveraged and used in the A&D community. So how can you use your LCA and EPD? You can use it both internally and externally. So internally, I was mentioning understanding the hotspots, identifying opportunities for improvement, using it for your new product development process. External drivers, definitely as a tool depending on your industry. If you have architects, corporations, using to evaluate and select materials, understanding you can meet the requirements of green building standards, or to satisfy any of your end customers or scope 3 requests forms, or forms to know what your carbon footprint is. And this is to hone in on that internal purpose. So because you're developing a snapshot, you can do what if scenarios and really play around with your LCA model to identify where can you really move the needle in order to reduce your impact the most for maybe your next generation of product. We work with a few manufacturers that have to put their products through this process or else they won't get approval. So they actually have to show a reduction in impact before it can actually get past the next gate of new product development. And then for those who are like, I don't need an EPD, I'm a supplier, this isn't relevant to me, you can always do a fact sheet. And this was just one example of one we did for the industry-wide for USB, but this is an example of what a fact sheet has. All the same pertinent information. It's just really not, it doesn't have any of those like ISO 14025 standards or specific standards to the PCR. Now, as far as standards, legislation, some of the drivers for EPDs, there are a lot of green building programs. I know I mentioned LEED, Leadership in Energy Environmental Design. It has seen an increase over the years of the number of certified projects for LEED. A lot of corporations are also using LEED as a metric to measure their sustainability programs at the building level so that they can understand, okay, 10 million square feet of our operations is LEED certified. So you are seeing an increase in that, and EPDs directly contribute to LEED. Specifically, they contribute to the LEED material and resources credit. And this is where I mentioned you can get additional, credit, essentially like counting as additional products if you have optimization. There's also LEED V5 for those who are not aware. This is coming out as well. They just closed their comment period. If anyone wants any links to LEED V5, please let me know. In the interest of time, I'm going to go a little quicker, but there is LEED as well. This is the newest version coming out. And then anyone who works with architects design community, there's Architecture 2030. You might have worked with some of these firms or be familiar of these firms. They're committing to energy efficiency and carbon neutrality. You can use this directory to actually look up these firms, see what commitments they've made. So keeping that in mind, that's another driver. Then at the federal level, there's the EPA's low embodied carbon construction materials program. So they're trying to facilitate procurement of low embodied carbon materials. And at the state level, there's a lot of embodied carbon policies as well. So I mentioned this before, but the Carbon Leadership Forum has done the great effort of mapping out all of these different policies. So if you're selling into these states, maybe take a look, see what requirements are there when it comes to embodied carbon policies. There's also been Buy Clean Acts. This is just an example. It was specific to eligible materials, but one thing I wanted to note is that they actually went a step further and set maximum allowable limits. So it wasn't just enough to have an EPD or have an LCA. You had to show that you were below a certain threshold in terms of global warming potential. So it kind of went that next level. There's also the Senate bills 253 and 261 that were just released this year. And this one shook things up a bit because it's one of the first mandatory requirements for reporting Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So if you are an organization, you do over $1 billion in revenue, and you sell into the state of California, you will have to disclose your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Now, thinking of those, oh, I don't meet that criteria, but if any of your end customers do, they have to report on their Scope 3 emissions, and that is you. So even if you don't make that threshold, if any of the people you're selling to do, it will tie you in because you're part of their Scope 3 emissions. Great. And then there's also Colorado. They have greenhouse gas emission reductions. So there are a lot of different state level initiatives of reaching net zero. So again, this is just another example of the state level. I have 2 minutes to spare, but I just wanted to make sure to get through all of this. Again, I know it's a lot of content, so please, if you have questions or please, feel free to reach out to Wendy or I. We're happy to help.
Wow, well, that was awesome because I saw the slides in advance and I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness, how can we do this in an hour? But you did it in less than an hour. Tremendous amount of content, but that shows how complicated this whole topic is, I think.
And these were the narrowed down versions, so there's a lot more content we can provide too.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, this is, high level was the goal for today, just to start introducing the concepts and the topics and the terminology and things like that. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So thank you everybody for joining today. Please stay here for one more minute.